Hi, this is Brian Kim. I want to share with you case number 32 in the best way to do cataract surgery series. This is a medium-sized pupil, a somewhat denser lens. And the interesting part of this case is the lens won't spin. And so normally in my experience, when the lens doesn't spin, it can be one of two things. It can be a very sticky lens, or it could be a case of zonulopathy or some level of zonular disease. And so the key is not to perseverate and rip the zonules and try to spin the lens when it doesn't want to spin. Rather, you want to employ mechanical fracturing techniques, double chop, cross chop, and be able to prolapse pieces out of the bag. And by doing it that way, this is a much more gentle on the zonules, and you'll be able to see you really don't need to spin the lens in the bag. You really don't have to spin the lens at all with mechanical fracturing techniques. So I'm using my corneal mark to help me center and size my rhexis. And with the help of a Q-tip, I'm flattening out, making my paracentesis incision superiorly and inferiorly. I want to make sure I have a flat approach parallel to the iris plane to help me achieve a self-sealing corneal incision. I'm injecting some intracameral lidocaine and then some intracameral epinephrine. I'm going around circumferentially, painting on top of the iris and under the iris. I'm injecting some dispersive viscoelastic now to inflate the anterior chamber and viscodilate the pupil, do my triplanar corneal incision, make a vertical groove, tunnel into the groove, into the cornea, and then dimple down, and that's the triplanar corneal incision. I'm going to move to my Capsulorhexis. I'm using forceps technique to puncture the central rhexis, point downward towards me subincisionally. And as I do this, I get a little bit of a flap. I grab the right side edge of the flap and go around, again, circumferentially following the marks of my previous corneal marking, trying to stay within those marks. In this case, because the pupil's a little bit smaller, I'm able to follow the marks as well as follow the pupil edge. Grabbing and re-grabbing, you want to go every couple of clock hours, and then I'm finishing it off. I like to burp some viscoelastic at the end of the rhexis, and then it's going to be my Capsulorhexis hydrodissection technique. I'm going out with the cannula flat out to the contralateral equator underneath the anterior capsulorhexis edge, turn it downward, and then you get a nice fluid wave. I'm decompressing on the left side. I didn't feel like I got a good wave, and so I went back again to see if I can hydrodissect. And then I'm trying to spin it on the right side. You could tell I'm having a little bit of a difficult time doing that. You can see the lens is a little bit wobbly. And so I am concerned that there might be some underlying zonular disease, and it could be the explanation as to why I'm having trouble to spin the lens as well. And so I don't really have a great separation of the lens from the bag. Rather than trying to turn the lens, I don't really need to spin the lens with my technique. So I decide to move forward, lift the incision with a chopper, go in with irrigation off with the phaco tip. I'm removing the surface epinuclear material, go underneath the anterior capsulorhexis edge, underneath the epinuclear ridge, out to the capsular fornix, turn the phaco tip vertically, subincisionally, crush the lens material. You can see there's quite a bit of density to this lens, and that's the double chop maneuver. Place the chopper out to the contralateral equator, pulling it centrally towards the phaco tip, crushing the right heminucleus in half, and that's the cross chop maneuver. I'm going after this first quadrant, but you can see the lens is not presenting itself quite the way I want to. So I get out again and pull the chopper centrally towards the phaco tip, and I remove a small little bit there. And I think that that removal of that small little bit will help kind of loosen up the rest of the lens. It's kind of jigsawed together. And so I'm going to use some high vacuum, and it prolapses the lens up, get the chopper around the lens piece, crush it against the phaco tip, and then I'm using mechanical fracturing forces, a little bit of vacuum, as well as ultrasonic energy to remove that first quadrant. I'm placing the chopper out to the equator again around the second quadrant, pulling it centrally and crushing it against the phaco tip. I'm beginning to break down that second quadrant. I place the chopper around the lens material again, crushing it against the phaco tip, and I do this over and over again, getting the chopper around the lens material and crushing it against the phaco tip. This is the last bit of that second quadrant. I'm pulling it up out of the bag, grabbing it with a little bit of vacuum. Once it's in good position, I crush it with the chopper against the phaco tip and emulsify the lens piece. I twirl the second heminucleus in front of me, get the chopper out around the lens piece, crush it against the phaco tip. The phaco is fairly deep and crushing the entire girth of the lens, going after the third quadrant, placing the chopper out to the equator, and then crushing the lens piece. I'm using some vacuum to bring up that piece up, get the chopper around the lens piece, crushing it against the phaco tip, and then emulsifying the lens pieces. Using vacuum again to get around that other piece, placing the chopper around the lens piece, crushing it against the chopper, and then emulsifying it. I still have a little bit of that third quadrant left, but I'm going after the fourth quadrant, place the chopper around the equator, crushing the lens against the phaco tip, and that crushes that fourth quadrant. I'm again using successive mechanical fracturing movements, crushing the lens material using the chopper against the phaco tip, and then using high vacuum and little bursts of ultrasonic energy to remove the remaining lens pieces. Again, using vacuum to hold the lens piece, getting the chopper around the lens piece, crushing it, and then evacuating the lens pieces. And so those are the last bits of the lens that's left, and that is the entire endonucleus is removed now. I'm going after the epinuclear material. I'm going after the anterior edge of the lens material, and it prolapses up. So the epinuclear material in front of me is out now. Now I have to go after the lens material underneath me. I'm using the chopper to kind of lift and loosen up the epinuclear material, and then using the vacuum on the anterior edge of the epinucleus to evacuate the lens material. I'm using the chopper to lift the lens material and then using the phaco tip to remove the last bit of the epinuclear material. I take the chopper out, push BSS in with a cannula, take the phaco tip out, switch it with the INA handpiece. I begin my cortical removal. I always start sub-incisionally. I'm removing the cortical material right up against the anterior capsulorhexis edge. I'm using foot modulation to control the amount of vacuum. As I'm moving the cortical material, you can see that the bag is quite a bit floppy. See, I'm pulling, you can see stria in the capsular bag on the posterior capsule as I'm pulling. Using high vacuum, it finally comes out, and then I have this last bit of cortical material. I'm trying to get up against the anterior capsulorhexis edge because I want to peel it from the anterior side. Most of the cortical material is removed. As I switch to the polish mode, you can see immediately I get the stria that's causing puckering of the posterior capsule, and that's usually a sign of weak zonules or some type of zonulopathy. And so I don't tend to go too crazy and aggressive in polishing the bag when I do this because I know there's going to be some weakness to the bag. And so I'm just very carefully with the polish mode trying to remove any posterior capsular surface cortical material. Now I'm pushing BSS into the capsular fornix as well as sub-incisionally. It looks fairly clean. I'm switching to a cohesive viscoelastic, pushing it to inflate the capsular bag. And then I'm going to start polishing first on the left side. And interestingly, it looks fairly clean. And then I'm switching to the right side here. My technician gave me the sweep upside down. She gave me the wrong side first, but that's okay. Go ahead and finish sweeping and then inject my single piece acrylic intraocular lens within the capsular bag. With irrigation off, I go in, free up the leading and trailing haptic, go underneath the lens, rotate it 90 degrees clockwise, tilt the lens so I can get all that viscoelastic out from underneath the lens and out of the bag. reposition the lens, making sure there's no viscoelastic in the bag, and then switching to the visco mode, remove all the viscoelastic in the anterior chamber. I'm just kind of tapping on the lens to help liberate any potential viscoelastic between the bag and the lens. Pushing VSS into the angle to make sure there's no viscoelastic trapped in the angle, and then I hydrate my incisions. So you can see this is a medium-sized pupil, moderately dense lens. I use mechanical fracturing, double chop, cross chop to disassemble the lens. This had some level of zonular disease, and that's why the lens didn't spin very well. But nonetheless, I was able to disassemble the lens very easily without much difficulty. And using mechanical fracturing forces, even though the lens didn't spin, I was able to pull the lens pieces out and again, spare the zonules and the bag of any stress. So I hope this was helpful to you, and I thank you for your attention.